Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg himself called it a breach of trust. Users called it every name in the book. But whatever you call it, access to private profile information of millions turned into political opportunity for the Trump campaign in the last U.S. election. Now people and governments around the world want answers and assurances about such data mining. Joining us now to understand how this computes for Canada in the nation's capital, Sarah Bannerman. She's Associate Professor and Canada Research Chair in Communication Policy and Governance at Hamilton's McMaster University. And with us here in studio, Jesse Hirsch, technology expert, president of MetaViews, an internet think tank. Jesse, good to have you back in that chair. And Sarah, nice to have you on our program tonight as well. I want to just start with, a little background here. Cambridge Analytica, of course, which is the company at the middle of all this, gathered data from Facebook using an app called This Is Your Digital Life. It was created by a Cambridge psychology prof named Alexander Kogan. Christopher Wiley, which is a name you've heard a lot about. He's the Canadian guy. He helped create Cambridge Analytica, and he's the guy who blew the whistle on this whole thing. Let's hear from him. Sheldon, go.
What we did is we used applications that people would join. They would fill out psychological surveys, and then that app would then go and pull all of their Facebook data and relate how they answered the questions on the survey to their Facebook data. And from that, we were able to then make inferences or predictions about people who we haven't yet spoken to, but we have pulled their Facebook data. So it allowed us to profile upwards of 50 million Americans over the span of a couple months and understand not only their personality traits, but how they think and how they would likely react to different kinds of information. And what is it exactly that we need to do in order to pick at certain mental or emotional vulnerabilities so that those people would behave in a particular way that was conducive to Steve Bannon's objective.
Steve Bannon, of course, being the guy many people called Trump's brain. Okay, Jesse, what's been the fallout?
I think it's discrediting of Facebook, questioning the governance policies, questioning the privacy policies. But I think it's also created an awareness of data and the role that data plays, whether in politics or whether in the marketplace, that maybe wakes people up a little bit as to the way in which their data is being used against them. But I think more importantly, it's waking regulators up to the responsibility they have to both protect people's privacy, but also ensure that our electoral process is fair and that it's not being manipulated by people who have information about us and can motivate who we vote for.
Some of the fallout from this, Sarah, was, one guy lost $5 billion, which is pretty amazing. That guy would be Mark Zuckerberg. What other bits of fallout have you seen since this story became public?
Well, I think it just really, as Jesse said, raised awareness of the fact that letting a company like Facebook control and be responsible for so much personal information is just really like letting the fox guard the hen house. I mean, Facebook has been charged by the FTC and had to settle with them for deceptive privacy practices in 2011. For creating privacy settings in your account that you could set and then completely disregarding those settings that you'd made, letting information that you had set to be available, say, only to friends, flow out to apps and even to be made available to the public. And Facebook has taken a number of, or made a number of promises, such as restricting the data that they make available to apps. But I think this is really like turning down the tap after the bathtub's already been overflowing for 14 years. You know, it's a good idea, but it's too late.
It's a bit late, you think. Okay. Well, Jesse, there is a balance here, of course, between ethical behavior by the protagonist in question and profitability. And what have the events of the past week told us about what regulators, politicians, the public, etc., what they care about more?
I think it's a very difficult balance, and in particular, I think what Facebook is struggling with, and that they have built a better built mousetrap. They have a surveillance system. Their entire business model is based on surveillance. It's interesting, in Zuckerberg's interview with CNN, he said, you know, we've looked at having a Facebook that we charge people for. That's not based on advertising, where we actually protect your data, but we don't believe that consumers desire that.
Do you agree with that?
It depends. I think there are some consumers who would pay, but yes, the vast majority would not. And Facebook is powerful because everyone's there. We wouldn't go there if we couldn't connect with everyone else. So I think this does question the business model of Facebook, but it's also putting light on Facebook as a monopoly. That there isn't somewhere else I can go to connect with my nieces. There isn't somewhere else that I can go to debate yesterday's episode on the agenda. So they really occupy a very important part of our public commons at the expense of our privacy and our data. And I think we're trying to reconcile the value that Facebook gives us with the cost that we pay vis-a-vis our personal information.
Here's the official statement, Sarah, and I'll get you to comment on this after I read an excerpt from it. Mark Zuckerberg, Sheryl Sandberg, and their teams are working around the clock to get all the facts and take the appropriate action moving forward because they understand the seriousness of this issue. The entire company is outraged we were deceived. We are committed to vigorously enforcing our policies to protect people's information, and we'll take whatever steps are required to see that this happens. Your take on that?
I think anybody who's been watching Facebook's privacy practices for the last 10 years is probably doing an eye roll right now because I think, the thing is that you're right, Facebook is invested in making information available, in data mining. They aren't invested in protecting privacy, and they haven't been. I think the people who need to be able to regulate on privacy is government. We do need stronger privacy laws. And I think we also do need to take a look at the relationship between political parties, government, and platforms like Facebook, because I think Canadians at this point need to know that that relationship isn't too cozy. Facebook has a political affairs unit that I think is a little bit worrying. They, in some cases, they work with political parties, even embed employees in campaigns. Then some political parties may win elections. They end up having close relationships potentially with governments in power who are then supposed to be able to regulate. And I think those are relationships that we should take a look at and that we should be concerned about.
Jesse, let me get your take on, this is an obviously good name for something that comes out every day. The New York Times does a podcast every day called The Daily. And here's what they had to say about this. Facebook was wide open. Likes, by default, were public. So scraping them was very easy. And a researcher found that on an average of 68 likes, he could predict amazing things like your skin color with 95% accuracy, your sexual orientation with 85% accuracy. These guys had developed this technique that they claimed could reveal a tremendous amount about people's personalities. You give them 70 likes, and they would know you better than your friends. At 150, better than your parents. At 300, better than your own partners. Is the solution to this, presuming we don't want people to know that much about us, just stop liking anything on Facebook?
No, not at all. No? Especially, think about the media. Every show ends with like us on Facebook. There is an incredible amount of both peer pressure and social pressure that encourages us to use Facebook. A better way would be to actually respect privacy. So, for example, imagine the regulation, privacy by default. So that by default, all your privacy settings on Facebook are set to the max. So that you as a user are not expected to put in all the work to figure out all the settings and flip all the switches to protect your information.
So it's not that way now?
No, now it's the opposite. Now it's surveillance by default.
I see.
So you have to go through and set all those privacy settings. I mean, it was like that Rogers reverse billing scandal about 10 years ago, right? The opt-in. It's the same idea. People are opting into Facebook surveillance without really consenting to it, because no one really reads the privacy policy. Whereas imagine if we mandated the opposite. We mandated that said every new Facebook user and every existing Facebook user gets all the privacy settings turned on, and then if you want advertisements, you can turn them off. Or if you want to contribute to research, you could turn them off. But by that default protection, that would have prevented this particular episode and would give people more security to connect with friends and family without feeling like they're being spied on.
Indeed, but I suspect, Sarah, that if governments regulated in that fashion, the value of Facebook would decrease by 50% overnight. Is that fair to say?
Well, I think it would be possible to do the kinds of things that Jesse is suggesting, and it would be possible to set everything by default. When people sign in for the first time, sign up for an account, maybe Facebook would recommend changing certain privacy settings, saying our service won't work well unless you do this. I think that there are steps in the direction like what Jesse is suggesting that do need to be taken, and I do think they need to be mandated by law. I do think that our privacy commissioner does need more powers to audit, to make orders, and to enforce, fine companies that are bad actors. And I think that regulation is really necessary just for the reasons that Jesse said. I mean, these companies are practically monopolies now. That's a good reason to regulate. But also they're shaping the kind of infrastructure on which our democracy is built at this point. And I think that's a good reason to regulate.
While you've got the floor, Sarah, let me do one follow-up with you, which is, what about a full public archive of all online ads? What value would that add to this debate?
This is what I've been calling for this week in an article published in Maclean's. I think we need a full online archive of ads, and election ads the most. And companies are already moving in this direction. They are building and promising Twitter, Facebook, archives, especially of election ads. And we really need that, I think, to be able to see what ads are out there, whether there's deceptive or duplicitous ads out there. We need to know about it. Also, it would be really interesting. It would make for interesting reporting. There is reporting on ads, whether it's in the election or whether it's in the Super Bowl. And it's important to, I think, be aware, and it would be really interesting. And I think Canadians, we need that at this point to monitor the health of our democratic discourse.
Well, let me follow up on that with you, Jesse, because of course we are, not that far away from an election campaign here in the province of Ontario, and there is something called the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act, PIPEDA for short. It's a federal privacy law, but I gather it does not apply to political parties. Should it?
It absolutely should. I mean, right now, it only applies to commercial activities, so it doesn't apply to political parties or nonprofits. But politics has evolved. I mean, part of what we're discussing here is the digital equivalent of door knocking, right? Politicians still sort of do knock on doors in their riding, but now you can connect with people via Facebook. You can connect with people via Twitter. And there is an opportunity there for manipulation that I think the initiative that Sarah mentioned of having these ads be more transparent help. But political parties are gathering a ridiculous amount of information about Canadians, which they should be able to as part of their ability to campaign, but there should still be oversight. There still should be means that Canadians can maintain their privacy. Because as far as I know, not only do all political parties collect information about Canadians, but they rank us based on how likely we are to support them, which therefore means that all political parties are also building enemies lists, because they're building lists of people who don't support them or who oppose them. And that gets kind of scary when you think about if that information falls into the wrong hands. And at the very least, it might discourage people from participating politically because they don't want their information to fall into these party databases that currently are completely unregulated and can have all sorts of intimate information, like the stuff we associate with Facebook, but instead in private party databases that are used either to get out the vote or to not get out the vote, in terms of deciding which houses to ignore because they're your opponent's supporters and you don't want them to actually be active.
That sounds a bit Nixonian.
Absolutely.
Richard, I mean, not Robert, for an Ontario political analogy there. Sarah, the feds announced this past week that they're open to strengthening the federal privacy laws. They're looking into whether or not personal information of Canadians has been compromised. What confidence do you have that that they will fix whatever ails this problem?
I hope they will. I certainly hope they will, and I hope that the concerns that have been raised this week are powerful enough to cause them to do that. I am a little concerned about some of the relationships, as I said earlier, and so I think that's something that Canadians need to keep an eye on in terms of, say, revolving doors between political parties or government and platforms. And I also think another, we do need more powers to the Privacy Commissioner, fining, auditing, and so on. But I also think that another thing we could consider at this point, universities have ethics review boards to review how research is done, how personal information is handled, the type of analytics that is done. Maybe political parties and government as well. Private companies sometimes turn to ethics review boards, and maybe the research bureaus of political parties or governments need to start to consider ethics review as well, because of the power of this data, the extent of the data, and in order to ensure that there are those institutional checks on the ethical practices and the use of those of that data.
Jesse, let me ask you about something called cyber hygiene. Back in October, Facebook announced that a Canadian election integrity initiative would help ensure the platform is a space for authentic civic engagement. And they included something called cyber hygiene training. I guess a two-part question here. Number one, do we need this? Number two, are they the right people to be doing it?
Maybe and no. And you know, the first question, do we need this? Really, it's talking about media literacy, and it's talking about being able to determine what is fake news and what's not, about how to navigate an increasingly diverse information ecosystem. Part of it was sort of speaking to what Sarah was talking about in terms of transparency of political advertising. So Facebook will provide partial transparency of political advertising here in Canada as a pilot project to then roll out in the rest of the world. But to your second question, is Facebook the right entity to do this? Absolutely not. And you know, we sort of joke about how Facebook creates echo chambers, how people who use Facebook tend to only want to see people who agree with them. Well, I argue that Facebook as a corporation is an echo chamber, that the company only wants to listen to people who speak about Facebook in a way that they agree, and they ignore their critics. They ignore people who would say, hey, maybe there's a better way to resolve, say, fake news or trolling or abuse. So what Facebook needs is outside help. They need a little bit of critical perspective.
From whom?
Well, Sarah's example of an ethics review board, I think, is viable, to have a collection of researchers who are chosen by peer review to kind of help Facebook with these problems. But I think the other option would be Facebook's own users. I mean, part of what we're talking about right now is a society of 2.2 billion people, because that's how many Facebook users there are. But it's currently a dictatorship because Mark Zuckerberg is in sole control. I think, and political scientists generally argue, that dictatorships are really inefficient at managing a society versus democracies. You get the best and the brightest, and you have more people solving these problems. So instead of deleting Facebook, what if we democratized Facebook?
How do you do that?
Well, Facebook could set up a parliament and allow its users to vote for representatives who could then be a body, an assembly that could discuss privacy, that could discuss data mining, that could discuss advertising, and give Facebook not only an external perspective, but legitimacy. Because all of a sudden, Facebook could say, well, we spoke to our parliament, and they said it's okay to give up a little bit of privacy to get free stuff. So it's a way of solving their governance problem, which is they don't know how to respond to these crises because they don't have the expertise, because they literally are in an echo chamber.
Well, okay, Sarah, let me ask you to comment on that from this perspective as well. Most dictators, just using your analogy, I'm not opining that, but most dictators who voluntarily give up power end up in front of a firing squad. So what's in it for Mark Zuckerberg to do this?
I think at this point, it's a great way for him to get the feedback that is needed from users and to create an element of transparency. I think Jesse's idea is a great idea, or something in that direction. Zuckerberg has a huge amount of decision-making power through his shares in Facebook, where he has a relatively small proportion, but a large proportion. I think I read 60% of the control of Facebook. And I think that those kinds of solutions of democratic input are a great idea. But I also do think there's a role for government, and that's the most immediate solution in terms of putting parameters around Facebook's use and protection of personal data.
In our last minute, though, Sarah, what's in it for Zuckerberg to give up that kind of power? Right now, he's a decider of one. Why would he want to relinquish that kind of domination over such an important international player as Facebook?
Well, that's the whole point, is that he might not want to, and that's why we need laws to require him to do that, and strong enforcement as well.
Gotcha. Okay, my thanks to both of you for coming on TVO tonight and helping us out with this. Sarah Bannerman is Associate Professor and Canada Research Chair in Communication Policy and Governance, even though she is in the nation's capital. She is at McMaster University in the wonderful city of Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. And Jesse Hirsch, futurist. Futurist, eh, Jesse? I like that title. Researcher and public speaker. MetaViews is his company. And Jesse, we always appreciate your participation on this program as well. Thanks, you two.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.